quite there yet. You are live.
Thank you, Rachel. So welcome everyone to perhaps not the last meeting of our outcome measures work group. We are on a pretty tight time schedule in terms of getting recommendations to the board for inclusion of some information in the next update of the comprehensive implementation plan. So we are going to stay on track. I've promised Emma that I will stay to the timeline today, although we're already 9 minutes past where we were supposed to be. And I mentioned that this may not be the last meeting because Emma has put on the schedule another meeting on July 7th of the Outcomes Measures Group. Emma, did you want to say something about that?
Yes, so we had a few dates that we just wanted to get some feedback on in terms of availability, and July 7th was the one date that we did not get any feedback on, saying that folks wouldn't be able to make it. So we have put a hold on that date, Friday, July 7th from 3 to 5 p.m. That's a hold right now. If there's any issues, just let me know and let us know as quickly as possible if you can. That would be very helpful, just in case we didn't hear back, and that actually is an issue for a number of people, and we'll make some adjustments, but we did put that hold date on there. So thank you all for getting back in touch with us so quickly. We appreciate it.
And so for today, the plan is to finish off Pillar 3, go through the outcome measures for Pillar 3. Last time we met, we did output measures. And then for Pillar 4, both the output and the outcome measures that are for possible discussion. And this next meeting on July 7th, we would go over the Pillar 5 measures, as well as a preliminary report that would be shared with the AIB board. So if there's any, let me just entertain any sort of procedural or administrative questions right now before we jump into the PowerPoint. All right, thank you all. And I apologize that I'm going to appear to be curt as we get things going, but we really need to keep our conversations surrounded on the measures. I know oftentimes we like to kind of delve into different aspects of the blueprint and why this and not that, but we're going to stay laser focused on the measures or potential measures. Right, so Emma, do you want to share slides? So the first few slides were just a reminder of kind of the rules of the road and what we're doing in terms of ranking. But so 2 weeks ago, when we talked about Pillar 3 output measures, there was pretty good consensus around the idea that we'd measure some way the student access to college prep courses. And then a few other salient measures to folks were student satisfaction with career counseling, percentage of schools and districts offering pre-K through 12 instructional system fully aligned to the CCR standard, and the percentage of middle and high schools that provide students with career counseling in alignment with blueprint requirements to learn about post-secondary education and career options that align with their interests. And so those were the output measures, those things that we're expecting to change fairly quickly. So today we're looking at the outcome measures or potential ones. And on this next slide, Emma, you want to mention what the blue represents?
So the blue represents the outcome measures that are potentially or are going to be lifted to the blueprint level. So thinking about those blueprint level outcome measures that we have that may involve more than one pillar in terms of implementation and can also track student outcomes. We thought that it was appropriate to lift these outcome measures in addition to one of the ones that's already at the blueprint level to the blueprint level from the pillar level.
Okay. So, and you can see the list of other outcome measures that you had to rank. As a reminder, the blue stars indicating something that would have to be created from the ground up. And on the next slide, we also have the other outcome measures that were potential outcome measures to be ranked. So the exciting results are on the next slide. So we had some that I want to draw your attention to and just have a quick discussion. So the one that had the most votes for a first ranked item was percentage of students in each grade level on track for meeting the CCR standard in ELA and math. Does anybody want to talk about why they selected that one, or if anybody has concerns about that one? To voice those concerns?
Something that we've discussed in the past was whether or not we knew what the CCR standards are. And I think there is a discussion about them being in draft form right now, or you want to give an update on what the
I don't know how much of an update there is. I mean, by August, there is going to be a draft of the final report of the AIR study.
Yeah.
The preliminary interim report that they provided indicated that GPA, the inclusion of GPA along with those elements that are currently being utilized in the interim standard, which are ELA and math scores. The inclusion of GPA substantially improved the classification of students into successful completion of, depending on how they measured it several different ways of attaining 30 credits or 12 credits or and a certain GPA level. But so I would imagine that high school GPA may end up to be part of the CCR standard. I don't know if that's the case, but right now, given early information, that may be the case. My only concern of this is what is on track. That may need a whole validation study to determine what an on track score is in ELA or math or GPA. So I mean, that's more of an implementation of the measure concern and not necessarily this concept of measure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Michael?
Yeah, I had a different take on what on track might mean, although we hadn't discussed it. I assume that the outcome of the AIR study, whatever it says about GPA, it's going to have something in it that says these are the math skills and these are the English language arts skills that kids need in order to be placed in credit bearing rather than remedial courses. That's number one. Number two, I assume those are not going to be dramatically different than the grade by grade K-12 standards that Maryland adopted several years ago, right? Which essentially provide a staircase to get to the endpoint. And so I assumed that on track meant a fourth grader, right? With whatever test or measures are used, a fourth grader is on track if they're basically meeting the fourth grade standards. And you'd expect next year they'd be well positioned to meet the fifth grade standards and so on. That's how I understood the on track measure to be, although I may be the only person who thought of it that way.
Is there a problem with taking the on track out and saying percentage of students each year meeting the CCR standard?
Well, that is going to be a blueprint level measure already. So we're good on that one.
Okay.
I don't know if we'll do it at every grade level. Shamoya asked, isn't this about the 9th grade tracker?
And to better elaborate on that question, what I'm asking here is, are we going back down pre-K through 12 for tracking, or are we just talking about this tracking of students being ready to meet the CCR standard once they enter high school and then would actually be brought into the 9th grade tracking system?
Well, let me ask the folks in the room, would you like this to be reflective of all grade, as Michael was referring to, 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, or limit it to high school? Michael, is that a new hand up or is that the old hand up?
No, I'm just not good at putting my hand down. It's down.
All right, Queen says, I assumed it was focused on high school. Matt says the ninth grade tracker is about on-time graduation. And not the CCR stuff, is what I'm reading into your answer. Okay. So based on a few of those comments, I'm assuming that if we're determining CCR standard by 10th grade, I think it could be earlier years. Keisha and then Rachel.
I think to what Michael shared, I feel like that could be a goal, but for me, we would need kind of a longitudinal study to ensure that whatever the measures we're identifying at the earlier grades are actually the ones that reliably indicate the extent to which students meet CCR, right? So I don't know what's coming. I'm not sure what's coming in terms of the work, the research that's coming forward is going to allow us to be able to say, if a fourth grade student meets XYZ on the state assessment, we know that they will be successful in being CCR once they get to high school. So what some have already indicated, my thinking around CCR was that it was solely focused more on at the high school level in terms of measurement, but I do agree with Michael in terms of it would be great to have an opportunity to know the on-track piece earlier, but I just don't think we at this time would have enough information to accurately indicate that.
Rachel.
Well, let me speak to the intent of the blueprint and the vision of the blueprint. And it was very much what Michael described. Because if we're going to set a college and career ready standard that we want students to meet by the end of 10th grade, we need to have a system an instructional system that is designed so that every student has the ability to achieve that goal by the end of 10th grade. And we need to be able to measure whether kids are on track or not on track for that. And if they're not on track, that's where we need to push in the intervention services so that students get the supports they need to be on track, so that throughout their pre-K through 10 schooling, that we have an indication of where they are in terms of where we're trying to get to. As we think about alternative measurements for college and career readiness, then the assessments, it gets for sure more challenging to identify what those would be. But we, at a minimum, would hopefully have scores on the required assessments, federally required assessments, that would align with our college and career ready standards at the grades when those assessments are being taken. That at least gives us an indication of whether they're on track or not, though it might not be perfect. So that's certainly the intent of the Kerwin Commission recommendations in the blueprint.
Thank you. Ivory and then Joe.
Taking myself off mute. I wanted to just make sure that as we track before they actually get in the grade where the standard applies to them, is not overly reliant upon standardized tests. Because I do think that it would be a stretch to look at a standardized test, and understanding all of the complications we've had with standardized tests over the last 20 years, and the ways in which they could be more disruptive and create lack of understanding than really help us to create a good pathway, and also stratify the education system in ways that isn't necessarily helpful for those who need more nourishment. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you. Joe.
So it seems as though the two plausible mechanisms we would have for actually, identifying students that are on track at each grade level, would be at each grade level would be grades. That's done statewide, and then from third grade on up, we would have MCAP. And I guess if that's what the committee decides as the means for determining whether a student is on track or off track, then I think we should just be clear and say that as the measures.
Thanks, Joe. And actually, I want to go down and talk because this is very similar to one of the other measures that was considered by 4 people to be first choice, which is second from the bottom, percentage of third graders reading on grade level. So this is perhaps looking at a very small subset of that prior one. What do you all think of this as a measure? Percentage of third graders reading on grade level. And this would be a function of the MCAP, I would assume.
I would question how much of an outcome that is. If our goal is to get students to graduate actually ready for college and career, I think that, I don't know, I'm just uncomfortable calling that an overall outcome.
Well, if we had for this pillar, could we consider that an output? That, I mean, it would be hard to get folks college and career ready if they're starting at a disadvantage of not reading at grade level, at third grade.
Or could it be like a short-term outcome measure, or it just might be in a different timeline, but it could still be a good indicator of getting to that blueprint level outcome measure, which is reaching the college and career readiness standard. Because I think you're right, Shamaya, it wouldn't be the end all be all, but maybe a good indicator of the type of progress that's being made in early grades for addressing some of the gaps that are presenting themselves then.
Agreed, it's a progress indicator.
I agree.
Yeah, I would stop short at saying that someone who's not reading at grade level by third grade isn't on track to be college or career ready. I think when we make those kinds of leaps, it creates more confusion in the education system than help. I always think to when my visit to a elementary school was canceled in Alabama because the students had to do test prep that day.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I don't want to create a narrative out of this report that's saying that's making these kinds of leaps and not pushing people in a direction to do things that will truly help their students be motivated, not just have the cognitive abilities, but be motivated, because I don't think we can separate one from the other. And I do think that there's a lot of error associated with those tests, especially at that level, when children don't really have a full understanding of what the test is measuring. They may not have a good level of fidelity with the test taker and administrator. And, so, if we're going to look at grade level reading, that's one thing, but to make the leap that it's saying whether or not they're college and career ready, I think that may be an irresponsible use of the assessment.
Let me ask a question to you and everyone. What if, right now this says percentage of third grade reading on grade level. What if instead of having a criterion such as on grade level, we just said increases in reading scores? Is we're hoping to see increases in reading scores at third grade, at fourth grade, at fifth grade. Does that take some of that away, or for your concern, Ivory? Or because it's related to pillar 3, there's an implication that this is about college career readiness as we're measuring resource. I know I'm not making a coherent argument here. But
Yes on the first part. But you're right in your interpretation of my remarks. It goes a little deeper than that. It's us making that leap that a student not reading on grade level is not college and career ready, or that pushing them to be on grade level is the most important thing you can do to get them college and career ready, which I think historically has not worked. Like when you laser focus on reading, that does not seem to work with helping students to make the kind of gains that we want them to gain. It appears that strategy where you take a group of students, especially when they're clustered in certain schools, and you have a certain culture at that school that's on helping them to develop cognitive abilities, whereas the other schools where the students may have met that goal, they're focusing on more nourishing things like having speakers and other types of events. So I think that's the thing that concerns me is contributing to the narrative that students aren't college or career ready if they haven't reached the grade level. And I also speak by personal experiences. I don't think there was ever a measure when I was in school that said that I was on grade level, and it wasn't the types of things I see them do to remedy that now that helped me to get on track.
I just want to raise up something the Queen put in the chat, which is a lot of research uses 3rd grade as an early warning indicator for high school graduation success. So I think it works as a progress/short-term indicator. Right, Michael?
Yeah, and I have looked at that research extensively, and I think that it's very problematic. And if you want to share the research with me and we can talk about it, I certainly would be willing to do that.
Michael?
Yeah, so thank you. I find myself increasingly persuaded by Ivory's comments, to tell you the truth. So I'm a little surprised at that. It's not a comment about Ivory, it's a comment about the argument and the use of the data. But I am keenly aware of, first of all, there's already plenty of pressure on teachers and students from annual testing. And I've been deeply involved in that for 20 years. So I'm not criticizing it, but it is in a fact that those tests just come with pressures. Ivory's story reminded me of a time I visited a charter school in DC that my daughter was working in, and they were reporting the results of the NWEA MAP results, which aren't even accountability tests. They are just indicators of, instructional effectiveness, if you will, or where kids are. And those scores were posted in just the same way that the end of year scores are. And you could see the transformation of a test into yet a new level of accountability. So I'm concerned about that. The other is you're going to have 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th graders. You're going to have grade level results anyway, right? Regardless of the outcome of this discussion. So the evidence will be there. The pressure will be there. We don't need to add to it, I think, to generate yet another on track indicator. If you wanted to use something like that, though, at a minimum, I think you want to make sure, this is a call for research, you want to make sure that from the data that the state has from the use of the PARC tests, which have been around long enough, right? Is it in fact the case that the kid who's proficient at 3rd grade turns out to be proficient at 4th grade and all the way up? Is it really predictive of the ultimate outcome, or at least progress towards the ultimate outcome that we care about? If we don't know that, then there's surely no point in pushing this hard.
Thanks, Michael. So Emma, make sure that's down on the research agenda. Rachel?
Momentarily couldn't even remember how to turn off the mute. So just to continue with the Kerwin vision and what top performing systems do, I mean, this is something that is not like a standardized assessment process per se. And in fact, many top performing systems, they don't have the kind of annual assessment system that we do in the US, and they don't rely on the assessments the way we do generally for accountability. It's actually part of what teachers are doing in the classroom every single day, is evaluating where their students are, you know, relative to the standards for, you know, for that grade level and that subject. And when they identify that a student is not getting a concept or is not needs additional resources or a different, you know, approach, that they provide that, so that they're constantly assessing where their students are for, you know, in the lingo we're using, staying on track for college career readiness and in our verbiage, but just for success. So, you know, ideally this would be a measure, but I think it would be obviously a challenging data collection to do, but it's really something we would want to collect directly from the teachers, and so I don't even know what that would look like. But I mean, ultimately, I don't think it's necessarily about what the score is on the third grade MCAP ELA, for example. That's not the vision. Unfortunately, it's the data we have. And so I think we're kind of in that sort of space again, where it's like, okay, we have certain data that isn't necessarily the ideal. Do we use that? And as Michael said, we're going to have that anyway. And so do we try to work more towards the ideal, or, you know, what do we use?
All right, Joe, I'm going to give you the last word on this suite of topics. Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, and this is just a response to Rachel. I mean, I think the other data point we do have is grades, right? And I think in some ways, maybe that is, if the AIR study leans heavily on GPA, then maybe, you know, maybe the stars are in alignment, and really the optimal measure to capture proficiency in reading and math at each grade level is the grades that are assigned in reading and math by each student's teacher. And you know, that is something that is collected across the state. I mean, I think there clearly are some challenges with subjectivity, but you know, I think sometimes you know, you potentially just have to lean into that, knowing that there are, you know, benefits and disadvantages to any of these measures that we are using to track student proficiency.
All right, thanks, Joe. All right, I know we have nowhere near consensus, but I'm going to move on to a different topic because we have a lot of important topics here. There's one that got 3 first place votes and no other, which was percentage of students who have completed a post CCR pathway, disaggregated by grade level, and what they earned. For example, college credits, industry credential, or associate's degree. Some of you voted for this one first place. Discuss, please.
So if we go back to this question of like what actual outcomes are for the blueprint and what is going to be tangible for the general public to understand, I think it is the information captured in this measure. What was actually done, what does completion look like, what did students get, how well did they do, and you know what's gone on to happen.
Anyone want to argue not on any of these? I have a question of will we be delayed in defining what this is because we have to wait to find out what the LEA set up as post CCR pathways?
I think for me though, I'm not sure it'll be delayed, but when I look at some of the examples and parentheses around what we're currently stating as a post-CCR pathway, I reflect back on our previous conversation in terms of the designation of CCR and the consistency of how we're defining that. So, for example, currently as an LEA, MSDE has defined CCR in literacy or mathematics, which includes meeting an expected outcome on the state assessment. Technically, what if I, as a student, don't hit that marker, but I can be in a program in high school, be successful, and receive industry recognized credentials, right? And so I guess I'm a little conflicted in terms of, while it might be a post-CCR pathway, I might leave high school not having met the currently interim standards for being designated as CCR. So that's kind of where I'm stuck with this one. And again, students can leave high school with some of these things. So is this intended to be once I graduate from high school, or, we have students who are dually enrolled who earn their diploma and an associate's degree, or earn their diploma and leave with industry recognized credentials. So how do we kind of align those?
Any other thoughts on this one? So blueprint vision here again from Rachel. We are talking about students who are CCR and complete a CCR pathway. So I think Keisha, an answer Rachel would say, well, those folks weren't CCR, even though they may have completed something that is of value.
And I think that still tells us something, right? Like when we have the percentage of students who do complete, we also then get a sense of who has not completed. And we can also then track how they do and compare, things like the effectiveness of our standard and actually predicting the success of our students in the long term.
Yeah, I agree.
I want to switch over to one that is, we have some that are related to others, but this one, 10 people picked it to be rated somewhere between 1st and 5th and had one first place vote. Percentage of high school students who graduate on time in 12th grade. How do folks feel about that? Imagine getting a report for LEA over time, the percentage of students who graduate on time in 12th grade, and perhaps we get this by school as well. Keisha asks, on time meaning within 4 years, perhaps, since they started 9th grade.
So Laura?
Yep.
I'm pretty sure, state already reports on high school graduation rates.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's defined, I'm pretty sure, as graduating on time.
Mm-hmm.
So
right. So yes, it's already being tracked. The question is, do we set targets on it? And then if an LEA or high school or something does not meet that target, do we then have a conversation with that LEA about our concerns? And part of the role of this outcome measures tracking will be to inform decisions of release of funds to LEAs. It is not prescribed, if you don't meet the targets, then you don't get funds, but it is part of the informed process. So yeah, so that's what we're trying to decide here on, which of these outcomes get rolled into that report that is going to inform discussion.
So thank you. That was a helpful response to me. And it makes me think this is a really important indicator to include. In fact, it would seem a little silly to have a whole bunch of indicators and skip where the kids graduated on time. You'd have a hard time explaining that to the public, among others.
That is one advantage of this. I mean, there's a lot of public understanding of what it means to
Right.
graduate high school. Other comments on this one? Rachel is unmuting herself.
Sorry, just to play devil's advocate, which I know we don't really need, but let's say we have 100% high school graduation rate, but kids are not graduating college and career ready. Then I think that would not be what we're looking for.
I don't think you're playing devil's advocate. That was my thinking, Rachel, too. I wasn't convinced necessarily that on-time graduation rate actually told us what we need with this pillar and in this standard about students actually being college and career ready, right? So I think that's the goal, and that's what we want to, again, publicize and track and set targets around. So I don't think it's a super salient one to necessarily uplift in our like top 5 for target setting.
Would it be informative though for discussion that, hey, LEA or hey school, you have none of your students are graduating college and career ready, but they're all graduating. There's something wrong with your system in that you're passing the students through. Would we get that information if we don't have that as part of the conversation?
Shamora, you want to respond first? Okay.
I was just going to say that I think that kind of like proves the necessity of also having this measure, because it'll allow us to have another way to statistically check on the significance and the reliability of the information we're getting. And frankly, just at the community level, it may not be the most complete of data science pictures painted, but it is really accessible for folks.
Do we not think that tracking CCR just in general, like as we will by 10th grade, that won't be indicators or predictive enough of on-time graduation, since we already will have graduation rates? I think Michael is already stating that that data is collected. So we can compare it to that generally if we're seeing like how many students are CCR college career ready, like through the normal standard that the blueprint creates.
So Queen, from what I understand, what you're saying is, yeah, we can look at graduation rates, but we're not going to set targets on them. But if we see that there's some LEAs where, you know, we have a target for CCR, they're not getting there, but then we look just for background information on their graduation rates, and we would see, whoa, what are you guys doing? They're passing students through.
Are we looking at graduation rates by school or by district?
I would say by district, definitely. And I'm going to argue throughout this probably that we would get reports about range of school values.
Okay. Because, well, one, in looking at graduation rates and looking at the variability across schools and districts, it is quite rare to have very high graduation rates and low college participation. Typically, those schools that have the higher graduation rates, they are doing something that is in the best interest of their students, and the ones that have low graduation rates are the ones that have students that have a lot more problems in terms of their preparation. Another thing to keep in mind is that traditionally the way that graduation rates are tracked is by cohort measures. So they don't look at every individual student, but they look at cohorts that of a certain district or of a certain school, and they look at how many in that cohort is graduating from that school 4 years later. And so sometimes it's not a measure, oftentimes it's not a measure of whether or not the student is graduating, but whether or not the school is keeping those students on for their 4 years. And so if you have a school where there's a lot of students that are saying, you know, this school isn't working out for me, I'm leaving our district, where there's a lot of out migration for whatever reason. Sometimes it's gentrification, sometimes it's because of reputation. So just want to flag that to really look at how cohort or how the graduation rate is measured, and make sure that when we're explaining what it is we're accurately doing so.
Great. All right, in the interest of time, I'm going to just talk about one more of these, which is the one at the top. The percentage of students who complete a high school level registered apprenticeship through participating in a post-CCR pathway. And Matt noted in the chat that grad cohorts account for student mobility per the definition that MSDE uses. Thank you, Matt. All right, so percentage of students who complete a post-high school level who complete a high school level registered apprenticeship through participating in a post-CCR path. We had a good number of people think this is second, third, right, fourth, right, fifth, right. So is this a subset of the one that we talked about earlier? Percentage of students who have completed a post-CCR pathway based on what they earned?
I think that would make sense.
I think it's just one of the categories.
Yeah.
I think it would be the categories, and then also knowing that it's participating in a post CCR pathway and earning an industry credential, but not just earning an industry credential. You are completing an apprenticeship to get to that industry credential. That's a key thing that we would need to disaggregate for.
Okay, so it's credential, apprenticeship plus credential, as opposed to just credential, no apprenticeship.
Yeah, or earning a credential through participating in an apprenticeship.
Okay. But I think we can kind of think about combining that with the other one. That's where all the first ranks go, and then the two. Oh, that's interesting. That one just had rank ones.
Just to clarify, completing an apprenticeship is a credential.
Right.
Okay.
So it ends with a credential.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, I thought that I tried to get to that, but maybe not quite.
Sorry, I thought I was hearing that it's the pathway that, anyway, completing it is the credential.
Yes, that's what I was trying to say, and Rachel said that a lot better. So I'm sorry for the confusion.
Okay.
Thanks, Rachel.
But can you get a credential without doing an apprenticeship?
Yes.
Yeah, like a CDEA is a credential.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So we're just going to disentangle those two potential credentials. Okay, if you have additional comments about Pillar 3 outcome measures, I want you to please email Emma, or pretty much that's the easiest thing to do since you have emails from Emma every other day. So just respond to her on that one. I think we're going to move now to Pillar 4. Thank you for bearing with my pushing of the agenda here. Jackie, I think you start with walking through the flow chart logic map. We're calling this. Oh,
yeah. We thought this might be one of the more simple ones, but I don't know. There's a lot here. So again, emphasizing the word draft here. Started the draft here that I'm trying to read here. It's hard to see it, but this pillar, as you know, is about providing more resources for students to be successful. And in terms of the tasks involved in the pillar, we've divided them into additional funding, and then sort of the supports that are going to be provided with the additional funding, and tried to divide the supports into, because the funding is allocated by groups of students, increased in support for English language learners, for students with disabilities, for students in in schools with high concentrations of poverty, and then tried to group the tasks under the supports that are provided for those different groups of students. On the left, in the darker green, English language learners, students with disabilities, concentration of poverties, and then the supports for all students which is focused on a lot of discussions we've had around providing behavioral support for students, as well as access to. We moved some of this actually, so I think we had a discussion about whether the expansion of school-based health centers should be grouped under supports for all students or students with high concentrations of poverty. I'm not sure how we ended up categorizing that, but we can come back to that. And then had the two overall outcomes here. The first around, and I can barely read the text here on my screen, but about that the students in these in these groups getting this additional support I actually cannot read the text on my screen. So someone, Emma, you might have to read the text for me here.
Okay,
But
which one are you on, Jackie?
The top outcome.
Students who are from low-income households attend schools with high concentrations of students who are from low-income families, who are English learners, and or who require special education services receive the additional resources and services that they need to achieve success in school and overall health and well-being.
Yeah. And then the other one is about all students who are receiving the behavioral health services that are a lot of the tasks in the pillar are about, and that those students are identified. I think we added the language identified and are accessing services that they need. On the outcome measures, on the measures list here, the ones that are in blue at the top, and I think we used the blue before, are ones that I think we've agreed to shift from being pillar level outcomes. They're about achieving CCR and different ways of disaggregating that, and thought that we had sort of decided that those were more appropriate at that level, and put some additional measures here from among the list of data that we were tracking that we thought were more aligned with what this pillar was about, of ensuring that students, ELL students and the other students in these groups are actually benefiting from the supports that we're providing with this extra funding, and the same on the bottom. And I think we might have some discussions about how best we will measure these things, because that's, I think, a continuing conversation. And then, of course, the very long list of data on the right side is data that we've discussed, both outcome measures data and output measures data. The highlights in blue are pieces of data that we added to this list from the Consortia for Community Supports initial plan, which is charged with looking at how well students across the board, all students' behavioral health needs are being addressed and how they would measure that. And so those are measures that we added in here from their initial set of measurements too, that we wanted to take advantage of. And
Jackie, could you clarify? So they are planning to measure these things?
yes.
Such as, so I'm just intrigued by the last one, increased use of positive classroom strategies, shape system measures of improvement in school climate.
Yeah, they one of the things that they're charged with doing is providing support to schools for and assistance to schools in creating better classroom climates to support behavioral health. So that is in the list of things that they're going to look at when they measure how well the LEAs are doing and how well the state is doing in providing the behavioral health supports that it is asked to provide.
Right. I'm from the consortium. I'm happy to provide more information about either of those measures if you're interested in that.
Actually, that may be really helpful if you could, for these highlighted in turquoise measures, what is the plan for working with the LEAs and how those will be implemented? And will it be done across a sample of classrooms, a sample of schools, all just the students that you're working with, etc.?
So the first one, percentage of students demonstrating improvement in social, sorry, it's hard to read, social, emotional, behavioral, and academic functioning. We have a list of assessment tools that consortium grantees will select from and indicate if the student is showing improvements. Now those would be just for the students who are receiving sort of tier 2 and tier 3 supports. So that's an important clarification. We obviously won't know, across the entire universe of students. The SHAPE system is a tool developed by the National Center for School Mental Health, which they receive federal funding to do that. The school district does an assessment of the supports that are in the schools in that school district. Most of the Maryland school districts are already using the SHAPE system. And so as part of the consortium, we anticipate, pushing out that to those who aren't currently using SHAPE system. So there's a tool that exists, and we will be collecting those measures.
Thank you, Lorianne. Well, I guess let's go forward and look at the output measures. So we have 2 slides worth of output measures that you all ranked over this past weekend. And going down to the ranking for the output. So there wasn't really clear consensus on, the most important thing. But let's look at the one where 10 people endorsed it to be one of the top 5. And that was, I have to read it in front of me here. Demonstrated implementation of the work group on English learners recommendations to improve the education of EL students in Maryland P through 12 schools. And then it says, see something about see the blueprint comprehensive plan pages X to Y. So would anyone like to talk about this measure? Rachel or Emma, you don't happen to have the blueprint comprehensive plan open to those pages, do you?
I do, funnily enough. So the thing is that there's quite a few recommendations that could that we were able to pull into the plan because it wouldn't require any sort of legislative change. So there's a lot to go through here, and there's quite a few that are also a matter of just implementation and directly like, yes, no, this was actually done. For example, adopting sorry, one second, I'm just finding a new one. One of the examples, adopting a bilingual certification and establishing pathways for educators to become bilingually certified. There are things like that are just, yes, and a bilingual certification was adopted. And then there are those, though, that would benefit, I think, potentially from, more targets or outcome measures that assess progress towards implementation potentially. So there's a lot here to go over. I could share our screen right now, but there is a lot to go over with those recommendations.
And those, and in the blueprint comprehensive plan, those were just recommendations. Were they? I don't recall of just that it was mandated that they do those things, or that those things be done.
So the recommendations that are currently in the plan and that are part of the comprehensive plan for MSDE and LEAs to implement based off of the work group, those were the ones that did not require legislative change, but were adopted as recommendations that needed to be implemented by the AIB. And that's on page 135 through 136 of the Blueprint Comprehensive Plan.
Okay, so they're recommendations from the work group.
They're recommendations,
but
yeah,
but they're not recommendations in the plan. They are, these things should be done.
Yes, yeah.
All right, let's not spend the time now unless Rachel had something to say, but
I was just gonna say, just at a glancing at the list, one thing that that seems like it might fit nicely is hold MSDE LEAs and schools accountable for EL achievement at all stages of English language development through enhanced reporting of data on English learners. So that might fit nicely into outcome measures data.
oh, and that linked directly to another one of these, which I've lost now, that had to deal with outcomes for English learners. Where did it go? Oh, maybe it's, sorry, it's on the outcome side. Not an output. So maybe we should hold off on that and talk about that as an outcome. All right, let's switch over to third from the top. We have counselor student ratios in schools at the at the state level and by LEA. Counselor student ratios in schools. Thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think that's important and easy to measure.
I don't know if there's more clarity that needs to be made around, are we talking about guidance counselors? Are we talking about social workers? We're talking about other mental health providers? Yeah, what type of counselor are we talking about, or are all of those counselors included?
And I think that if this measure were in there, we'd also have to look at whether there was students receiving supports from non-school staff. Sort of and or either your ratio is getting better or more students are receiving external supports.
You know, in a lot of cases, you have schools and districts that are partnering with local nonprofits that would also, you know, either fill into a college counseling role or into the role of like a mental health partner in, you know, a local agency that they're working with. So, you know, we would really have to suss out like who would be a qualified provider and how we would go through tracking that if we decided to opt for this.
From the mental health side, I mean, the qualified providers are defined, are they not? And Lorianne, I assume you.
So my understanding is when these ratios are done, we've had discussed the ratios, that it's typically just the school employed staff who are counted, but it's missing, right? The services that are provided by the community providers. You might have like a slippery slope if, you know, if someone is doing a program in like a mentoring program, is that really a counselor? Is that not a counselor? But I would imagine that you know, if you limited it to clinicians, to counselors and social workers, that might be a way to tighten up your definition. But you would want to, I think, come up with a pretty solid definition there.
Other comments on this area? All right. The next one that was also endorsed by 8 people is demonstrated implementation of the work group on instruction and services for students with disability recommendations to improve the education of students receiving special ... These recommendations were not implemented into the Blueprint Comprehensive Plan? Or given that the EL recommendations were specified?
So the work group, the plan requires MSDE to create a work group and have the work group meet and develop recommendations. And then presumably, once we get to that point, I think the final report is due next year, then we would put similar language in the plan to implement the recommendations.
Okay, so we may have the cart in front of the horse right now.
Just a little bit.
Okay. On this one. So, but we can put a pin on that to make sure we come back to it when any recommendations are included. All right, let's look at the one that's blue and orange down, second to last. This one I had a hard time with just because there's a lot of phrases here. Percentage of students who are assessed, determined to have behavioral health needs, and are offered documented supports and services. And I don't know, this one I have trouble with because I don't know what a target would be. Do I want a low number? Do I want a high number? I want an accurate number, but somebody else talk me through this measure.
Do you want me to do that, Emma? I've lost Emma.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Sounds great. Thanks, Rachel.
Sure. So the idea here was to try to combine measures so we didn't have multiple ones. So to really focus in on and in this world, you would want a high percentage. So the percentage of students who are assessed are found to have a behavioral health need and receive the services that they need.
Oh, okay. So
And
of the students who have been assessed and determined to have behavioral health,
Yes.
what is the percentage that are offered documented supports and services?
Yes.
Are offered or received?
I think we said offered because we can't necessarily require students to accept the services but that, I mean, Lorianne may have a different language to use there.
I think that language is great, Rachel. I mean, I think we've been thinking about the same thing. And we're looking at just similar measures.
You would think we had talked about it.
Okay, I understand better now. I need some wordsmithing, but Chelsea?
Yeah, this may be clarification purposes for me, but I guess when I read this, I read it the way you originally read it, which was percentage of students who are assessed as 1, determined to have behavioral health needs as 2, and then offer documented supports and services as 3. But what I heard you all just say was percentage of students who are assessed and determined to have behavioral health needs as 1. Is that correct? Because I think there's a difference. And I guess what I'm getting to is, are we using a universal screener that we would be assessing students with? And we had this conversation during the original Pillar 4 topic. Or are we only assessing certain students? And what is the indicator for what students we assess? I think this is a very complex output.
So I will just say, I think that the way Laura restated it is probably a better way we should reword it so that it's not read differently. In terms of the universal screener, I think at least the way the law is now, teachers and other staff in school buildings are required to be trained on recognizing behavioral health needs. And then if they identify students that are in need of, or, that they think may need additional services, then those students then are formally assessed. And then from that assessment comes a potential recommendation for additional supports that student would then be offered. Is that how we're envisioning it?
So then I guess this one should be more focused on percentage of students who are formally assessed and determined to have behavioral health needs and are offered documented supports and services. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Can we not lead with the word percentage? Say,
Right.
of the students who are formally assessed and received and found determined to have behavioral health needs, the percentage who are offered documented supports and services. Okay, so the population is those who are formally assessed and determined to have behavioral health needs. Queen, did you want to or add something in there?
No, I think that's right, because I was gonna just weigh in to say what would the distinction be between that one and the outcome measure or output measure right underneath it, if that distinction wasn't made. But I think what you're rewording or wordsmithing was just perfect just now, to get to, I think, the clarification that a lot of us needed with this one.
So, so actually, if we can go down to the one below it, since you've drawn my attention to it. This is of the students who are referred for assessment, the percentage that are actually assessed, basically. Is that?
Yes. Yes. So we could reword that one similarly.
They haven't really been identified as having a behavioral health need. They've been suspected of having
Right.
a behavioral health need. Or, all right, thank you for drawing my attention to that one, Queen. Let's skip up to second from the top. The ratio of staff to students in behavioral health centers. What are our thoughts on that one? Ratio of staff to students in behavioral health centers. And I have to be honest, and I do not know what a behavioral health center is, and whether each of the LEAs has these or multiples of these. If somebody wanted to talk me through what a behavioral health center is, I would very much appreciate it.
Is that supposed to be student health center and not behavioral health center, possibly?
I mean, my only thought would be if that's in correlation with community schools with the behavioral health center.
I'm
Supposed to be student health centers. It was a typo. Yeah, I was typing out behavioral health needs a lot, and so I accidentally typed out
okay.
behavioral health centers instead of student health centers. So I'm sorry about that.
Easy correction.
All right, but I still need a description of, so what's a student health center?
So Lorianne, I can do it, or you probably know it better than me.
Please go ahead.
Okay, so student health centers are and the technical term, which I think Emma was referring to, as school-based health centers. So school-based health centers are specific, have specific staffing requirements, and it's a program that is funded. It's a state and local funded program. The state provides resources. The program was recently moved from the State Department of Education to the Department of Health. And part of the blueprint expands the funding and the number of school-based health centers that that will be in schools. Typically, you know, there are health requirements for schools around you know, a nurse being available certain hours of the day, but it's different when you have a school-based health center. You have a significantly more hours of service and more staff and more credentialed staff.
Yeah,
And
that's great.
now
I would
exhausted my knowledge of school-based health centers.
So I would add there's school-based health centers in about 95 schools in Maryland. I wouldn't, these are all high need schools, but I don't think anyone would argue these are the highest need schools, that there was a lot of, deliberation about where they are going forward. There's a needs assessment and trying to be strategic about where those are placed. And then everything,
So, but
everything Rachel
are
said.
they mandated to have specific student to staff ratios? I don't know. And are we expecting that? I guess, growth in percentages of students, ready for kindergarten or whatever. We can see growth in that. We can imagine growth in that. Is this something that we could imagine sort of unbounded growth in? Percentage has a bound, yes, but is this something that we would, set targets on and expect? Or are you saying, Rachel, because there's increased funding, we should expect that they should increase the ratios or decrease the ratios?
So the ratio, I'm not sure that's the right measure, but I do think we absolutely have the expectation that there will be more school-based health centers, because we're providing funding for that. And I think, to Lorianne's point, maybe part of the metric might be that are located in high needs schools, so that they're actually, the expansion is sort of targeted where students need it the most.
So,
I mean, to me, it seems like rather than staff to student ratios, there's probably some benefit in just tracking the expansion, the number of individuals served, and also disaggregating it by population and maybe setting some targets for, a percentage of individuals served being from, low income groups or from, high minority groups. I think this is a new thing across the state, but I think very few people would question the value of having more robust medical services within a lot of our school communities. And I think just aspiring to have more health centers and more students served would be already success in and of itself if we could accomplish it.
Mm-hmm. I think that could be a good way of looking at it. And MDH, I know, is setting targets and is really looking to expand. You could look at the number of school-based health centers, or you could look at the number of schools served by school-based health centers. Some of them will serve more than one school, and that might more clearly capture what you're looking at.
and I will note that there's a measure that we haven't talked about, which is related percentage of schools through which students can access, this says physical health services, but we could define that either through school-based providers or community providers. So that is kind of what we've been talking about in terms of service, increasing the breadth of students served.
I put this in the chat, but want to be on record saying this. The Maryland Association of School-Based Health Centers would be a good group to engage, as they have been in the process of implementing school-based health centers prior to the blueprint, and have a lot of empirical evidence and best practices that we could probably learn from here.
And I do also want to make sure, Shimoya, your chat gets into the record of the live stream here. Earlier, you indicated we had a lot of concerns about this pillar's measures, most of which are captured in an email already sent to Emma. Just note here, though, there's a missed opportunity to get data on student perception/thoughts on services provided. There are measures asking if students' identified behavioral needs are assessed and addressed through services and supports, but does the student think that they're adequately addressed? Same for families regarding community schools. So there may be opportunities we should think about getting perceptions of the stakeholders, the students, with regards to whether their needs are served. So I think there's a couple that we haven't talked about, but it would be great if, again, just given time, we're going to switch over to talk about outcome measures. But if you want to add anything about those measures that we have not talked about, please email Emma. And now let's move over to the outcome measures. And I think once we get there, you'll see the one at the bottom is probably the easiest one to start with. We had 4 people indicate this is number 1 ranked. Percentage of students who are English learners who meet annual expected English proficiency targets. Anybody want to discuss this as a potential outcome measure for pillar 4? Were you all down?
No, nothing in particular. I just, I know I highlighted this as a measure as well, just to say that I think it's important as we think about more resources for students that we are tracking this data, and then also like understanding based on the data, what supports are being offered for these students that they're able to consistently meet this target. So I think it's just important for us to have it and monitor it for this work and for the public.
And the measure 2 up from this one, it's very similar, it's just different population. Percentage of students who require special education and or other services who meet annual expected progress targets as laid out in their IEPs. And I assume that says 504s at the end. How are we feeling about that one?
I think I'm of a similar mind as Queen here, in that I'm okay with it. I do think that there is probably a more strategic way to set up the disaggregation of outcome measures and output measures for this pillar, because there is so much that needs to be captured. And we are working with so many different populations. I think it's more important in this pillar than any other to offer folks data that drills down to the point. Since we are supposed to be improving chances of success for all students, we should be looking as finely as we can and be really grounded in the student experience of what's going on.
Are there some specific disaggregations that you can think of for this one?
So as an example, I think with the first one we looked at, the percentage of students who are English learners, this is probably like a broader question of students who have historically been underserved by schools, whether they're receiving the supports they require and whether they're seeing like increased success. And then under that, disaggregating by student group and still letting that be a singular measure. That way we can look at the success of individual student groups, but then we can also assess their experience and we can also assess the quality of implementation. Because I think otherwise, if we try to just whittle this down to 5 things, we're going to ultimately end up missing out on what we really do need to be measuring here. This was already the catch-all pillar because the Attorney General said that we couldn't address racial inequities in the work of the Kerwin Commission. So at the very least here, we should look as deep as we possibly can.
So I just want to make sure I have that right. Sorry. So Shamoya, keeping with this measure, but ensuring that we disaggregate by multiple groups. And, okay, all right, I just wanted to make sure I got that right. Thank
Well,
you.
I'm still questioning about what are the multiple groups. I mean, we could, I would imagine, be able to even look at language, groups by language spoken in the home. I mean, is that a level of detail that would be of interest? Like, maybe we're very good at helping students who are Spanish speaking because there tends to be a Spanish speaking teacher in the school. But for those who are coming in with Vietnamese, they get left behind at a greater rate. I don't know. I'm just trying to make sure that we are considering all the student groups that might be at the top of your mind. Tim?
Yeah.
Sorry, I raised my hand on the IEP 504 piece. I just wanted to mention that lumping them together is kind of confusing to like the data that's actually collected. So IEPs do have annual targets, but 504s do not necessarily have targets. So we don't want to include them in that same way because 504s are really about leveling the playing field based on a specific disability. They're not really about academic goals and measures like an IEP would have. So just when we word that in that way, I think it's kind of muddy, which is not good.
Thank you for raising that.
Chelsea?
Yeah, I'm just going to echo what Tim said, because that's exactly what I was getting ready to say. The other thing that I think, may just be something we consider. I'm not sure if we had this big conversation last time we talked about Pillar 4 and what we would be having as those expectations or the outcome for students with disabilities, and looking at how meeting state testing standards wasn't the way to go. And I think that this is a better way to measure that. However, from a legal standpoint, if a student is not making progress towards their IEP goal, that automatically requires an IEP meeting, us to revisit the instruction we're providing, revisit the goal. So I'm just not sure how beneficial this data would be, because if we're not making progress on an IEP goal, the IEP team needs to be meeting and redetermining what additional supports or services need to be provided to that student regardless. And I usually don't like to come to the table with concerns without having another suggestion, but I'm not real sure exactly what my suggestion would be in this situation. But maybe it's something that I could send to Emma later on. I just think it's something that we need to maybe consider when we look at that outcome.
Thank you, Chelsea.
For those of you who are at the LEA level or the MSDE level, what data are already reported about students with IEPs and progress? Or is it not? Like, is there any data about IEP was reevaluated and changed because they realized that the student was not progressing the way that they had hoped? And what is collected?
I mean, there's certainly data that we can pull from the Maryland Online IEP system that would capture some of that as far as when students weren't making progress and an IEP meeting was held to reconvene. We also have our state indicator data that we receive every year, usually in the spring. We just received ours, I think, last week, which shows a gap reduction is how we are now which is now reflected in our indicator data from the state. So instead of measuring what % of students are meeting the state target for assessments, we're now looking at the gap reduction from year to year between our students with disabilities and our general population across the state. So that to me was a really good measure for us, but we have a ton of data that we receive through indicator data that the state sets in compliance with the federal regulations as well. And that's at the local level every year.
And when you talk about reductions, so this is the gap between students with IEPs versus students who do not have IEPs on performance on the state exams.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Sorry, the chat seems active. So Shamoya asks, is data collected such that we can identify individual schools that may be struggling with student progression for those with IEPs? Those who have the data know better. Chelsea?
So the indicator data that we receive from the state is not by school, it's by county. However, I feel like the LAC at the county level may be able to disaggregate that information. It would just have to be a formula, I guess, is all I'll say. I mean, it would take some time to do that. And we'd have to make sure that the formula that the locals are using at the school level is consistent, unless the state could disaggregate that by school.
Yeah, I was just thinking about what Chelsea said about, I guess like IEPs, IDEA having to demonstrate progress towards IEP goals in general. And so I think it's like similar to some of the other measures that we've discussed. Might it be helpful to just like have the data to see, even if it's at the district level and not the school level, to see where there may be gaps towards like that progress for IEP goals? Like, is that helpful data to have in general?
Tim?
And to kind of also piggyback on that, like, I also think once we get to the school level or specific grade levels, the slice for special education specifically is very thin. And when you start to disaggregate that by like racial groups and things like that, it gets even thinner. And so like an individual school might have 2 or 3 students that are making up a population, and that change, or like monitoring that change, the students have left that school by the time we actually have implement, like it's not like a recurring theme, because the specific students' individual needs may impact a school's data for the multiple years that they have a specific student or a group of students. Then that student leaves and they address those needs, and that might then benefit the middle school that they go to or whatever, but it's not a direct strategy that's related to the group as a whole. It's a direct strategy related to the specific student, which is the point of the IEP. And so sometimes that data can be a little misleading in the ebb and flow of it, because it's not necessarily reflective of like overall practice. It's reflective of specific strategies for an individual student. So it's challenging when you get down to the school level to see trend. Whereas at the district level, at least the roll up of that is then overall staffing and other things that might have then like actually had some kind of impact related to the student's performance or the group of students.
Chelsea?
And I'm going to jump in behind him again, because I think that brings up a really important point too. And from a small county, we ran into this when we started looking at our school improvement plans, because once you really start looking at that group of students with disabilities at the school level, and you start disaggregating that data, it makes the students very identifiable, especially in a small district like ours. And so obviously we can't do that, because we can't identify who our students are with disabilities. But once you get down to that level in a district like Garrett County, it becomes problematic. So I just think that's something that we need to discuss as well.
And just want to go on the record that Shamoya says we should be measuring at the individual school level. It's how the blueprint allocates funds and should be a central way to measure accountability. This allows us to highlight development needs / exceptionalities of specific school leaders. I do worry about confidentiality and the suppression that probably is going to end up happening at the school level if it's at that level. All right, I want to switch us to a totally different measure now, right? And smack in the middle of this figure. And I'm going to reword it. Of teachers working in community schools receiving concentration of poverty school grants, the percentage who continue teaching in the same community school for more than 5 years. What are our thoughts on that? So this is a retention measure of the school staff. Any thoughts? Is 5, if we go with this measure, is 5 years the right length of time? Joe, you unmuted.
Yeah, I think I think we already have measures of teacher retention that we're tracking according to Pillar 2. And, while I'm a big advocate of community schools, I don't know if it's actually like the strategy is designed to be a driver of teacher retention. And, I think, so I would, I think there's some challenges with this, because I don't know if actually the community school strategy is really closely aligned to teacher retention in the same way that at least the research shows that it has benefits for student mobility, for student attendance, for school partnerships. There are other things that I think community schools are much stronger drivers in.
Does anyone want to counter Joe?
Or agree with me.
Or agree with him?
So I wanted to add, I do think we need to have a teacher measure for this pillar, simply because we are trying to retain more in these concentration of poverty schools. I'm not sure how the wording of this, I wasn't really thrilled with that, but I do think we need something specific to this pillar and for the teachers and tracking the teachers, because we do want our high quality teachers, especially if those teachers have gone through the career ladder in particular ways, looking at their national board certification and other measures, if they are staying and retaining in these particular schools, which is different than what we're seeing in Pillar 2. So it does call it out a little, but it could just be a subsection of that. So I agree that we're sort of doing it, but making sure that this piece is a subsection of the other would be fine with me. I was just going to say really quickly that, yes, perhaps there's a disaggregation for what's in Pillar 2, but if someone has a unique measure around teachers for community schools related to Pillar 4, I would like to raise that. Definitely would like to hear that as well. But I think what you're saying, Megan, about making it disaggregated makes a lot of sense.
Shimoya?
Yeah, just saying that back to my earlier point about us needing to look at this pillar a little bit differently, where it makes sense to evaluate the success of something like community schools, but to Joe's earlier point, there are a lot of other ways to measure that. And so this is just once more an appeal for us to be a little bit more innovative with the way we're measuring this pillar, because I agree with many of the things that folks are bringing up. And also think that community level stakeholders who want to know if the blueprint has been successful would be interested in this information. And I will leave it there.
Kelsey?
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add in response to Dr. Garvin was that I think a key piece that she mentioned was the national board certification, because really what we're looking at community schools is our highly qualified teachers that are in those schools. And so maybe it's just that we need to clarify the wording there, because I'm thinking as a county who will just be getting concentration of poverty schools, we may have turnover over the next couple of years as we shift our NBC certified teachers into those schools. And so I think that maybe what we need to clarify there is high quality or nationally board certified, or something indicating that the teachers that are highly qualified are working in those high need schools, I think is the important part of that outcome. Not just teachers in general.
All right, thank you. All right, and I'm going to move us on, given we're low on time. How about the rate of student attendance in community schools by school? The rate of student attendance. Yep, Tim?
Is it meant to be disaggregated by student groups or something along those lines? Because I mean, clearly it would be at the school level, but I would think that we'd be interested in that level.
Yeah, I think for all of these, it will be by,
Yeah.
we'll disaggregate by student group. But I think for some reason, and Emma, correct me if I'm wrong, that this one was particularly, per school, the student attendance. I'm wondering if it's an output measure, not really an outcome. I mean, it's going to precede any positive outcomes, because hopefully you're in school.
So Laura, so what you just stated, I agree. The first thing I thought about is we already, as an LEA, report attendance for schools, right? So I just was wondering about this being an outcome of what you said in terms instead of perhaps an output.
But is this reasonable thing to set a target on? Hey, LEA, we would love to see you work on your rates of attendance, or rates of absenteeism and decrease them, especially at your community schools.
I'm speaking for myself. I think that it's a reasonable ask because the services that we're providing students and families at those schools should hopefully improve attendance if we're doing it correctly. And so that should be something that we see, where over time it might not be the best target, but initially we're seeing attendance issues across the board, and specifically at high need schools, we're seeing more attendance issues. So I think that it would be an indicator, but if we slowly improve attendance and then we still have academic achievement differences, then what ends up happening, or how do those targets change? But at least initially, I think that that's a easy space where some of the services and health services might be pushing in, psych services and other things like that might be improving our actual attendance and getting students in the building, which is linked to the success based on the research.
Rachel?
I was just gonna add on to what I think that's why it was in the outcome measure, because it's not the leading indicator. The leading indicator is going to be the different types of services that the community schools are offering to students and their families. And as they're addressing those needs, the theory of action is then students are going to be more able to attend school regularly, which as an outcome. And then obviously the ultimate outcome is, the academic and social emotional health, etc.
Jenny?
But
I was just going to add, I agree that the attendance one is one of the kind of outcome measures associated with community schools. I guess one of my questions for this, but this is also true of some of the other measures here, is when we set the targets for this, I'm just wondering, are these targets against improvement in, compared longitudinally with the school that, that the school is improving its attendance over time for that school? Is it a set target that we're trying to set for all schools? Is it compared to schools that are not community schools? I was struggling with some of these because I think it depends on how you think about what kind of target or goal that you're trying to set for some of these measures. So that was one of the questions I had about this one. I think it makes sense as a measure, but I think it also matters how it gets measured and what the goal is.
Yeah, I think the intention for any target would be to examine baseline data for that unit, whatever that unit is, whether an LEA or whether it's a school, and baseline and hopefully baseline trend data in order to set the targets for that unit. I don't think that we will have the same target across units unless it's some sort of proportional increase or decrease. That is my impression, but you all should continue serving on this work group so you can have a voice in that process. All right, let me, and I apologize that I'm off video because my internet is unstable. But let me, there's another one that has at least one first ranked one, and then I think we'll be out of time. But it's diversity of Maryland school counselors compared to the diversity of the student population at the state level and by LEA. And I note that this is not about the community schools specifically, this is just generally across the state of Maryland. Diversity of Maryland school counselors compared to the diversity of student population at state level and by LEA. Thoughts? I'm going to throw in my own thought. Um, just like with the teacher diversity measure, if diversity in the staff is a goal, I would argue that we should look at it of the new hires and not of the entire staff in the state of Maryland, because it's going to be something very hard number to change within even 10 years. But if we can start changing the new hire population, that will be a bonus.
I just saw Shamoya's question in the chat too about the output measures tied back to the consortium's work. Just wanted to share that the consortium has proposed their own outcome measures and output measures that are not reflected here, since those are things that they'll be setting. So we just wanted to, provide the rankings for additional outcome measures. But that's a very good question, Shamoya.
Is there should we be considering just adopting some of their measures once they have identified those?
That's a good question.
So I'm happy to jump in. Some of the outcome measures are things that we already talked about, looking at the number of students who are receiving those targeted supports and show improvements in social, emotional, behavioral, and academic functioning. We're also looking at sort of population level data. But again, that takes a little bit longer to get that data and to see the improvements there. So I think that I might suggest that the main outcome thing we're looking at is these real improvements in their social, emotional, behavioral, and academic functioning.
I'm turning on my video again. I'll try to see if this works. I'd like to, given the time, we have to wrap up. But if you have additional comments you want to make about Pillar 4 outcome measures, I encourage you to email Emma. And I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of close us out and talk about what the next.
Great. Thank you. Yep, sounds good. Thanks, Laura. I'm just going to quickly touch on the Google Forms again. So if you are interested in sharing your input, if you are listening in today and would like to share your own input on the outcome measures and output measures, those Google Forms are accessible on the AIB website under the Workgroup tab. We welcome your input and would love to get your thoughts on that as well. And then there's also just general feedback forms on the outcome measures work groups and the work of the work group. So please share that feedback. Sorry, I have a little bit of a cold, so I'm trying not to cough. So for our next meeting, we have tentatively held time on July 7th from 3 to 5 p.m. to discuss the Pillar 5 outcome and output measures, and also to summarize the work group's findings and recommendations to the AIB during this meeting, to kind of summarize what we've done. Here's the consensus. Here's what we're looking at in terms of reporting out to the AIB. And I'll have more next steps on that as well in an email, just for ways to get that feedback and what that will look like. So please keep an eye out for that as well. And then this is just a reminder, we've talked about this a couple of times, but the work group will continue to meet post July 2023. So we're keeping this work going. We talked about this a lot today, but the target setting process will also be really critical. And we got a lot of really helpful insights today for that process. And I think we want to ensure that that is reflected in the targets that are set. And that's going to be the next big part of the work group's charge. So we're excited to have everyone continue to participate. But if you anticipate any challenges with that, please reach out to me and we'll try to talk that through and see what next steps are. But we, again, really appreciate your participation. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, I think we're ready to close out then.
All right, thank you all so
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
much for your time.